Fantasy football is a game where you select individual players from around the NFL and get rewarded based on how good their stat lines are each week. And it's undoubtedly seen a massive boom with the rise of the internet and more access than ever before to instant updates and highlights on social media. Is it good for the NFL's bottom line? Without question. There were over 60 million players last year alone, and the league has even started embracing outright gambling, probably for similar reasons. But do you know who fantasy football is bad for? My brain. I get that a video title like this one probably makes you think I'm going to give that boomer take about how focusing on individual players ruins the good old butterball foosball game I love, but that's not really what I'm here to do. In fact, I've played fantasy football every year for over a decade now, and I don't really plan to stop. But as a hobby, it is very far from perfect, and if we're being honest, sometimes it struggles to even be moderately satisfying. It has only been a couple of weeks, so that means that optimism is still relatively high, but considering I'm only going to grow more bitter as the year goes on, this kind of feels like the right moment to complain. Just strictly speaking, in terms of picking a sport to assemble a fake team of players for, football is a bad choice, because the violence inherent to it makes injuries more common in the NFL than any other professional league. Take this exact year, for example. Here is what the first round of your draft might have looked like if you joined a 12-team league before the season. And here are all of the players who have already sustained an injury through 2 weeks. It certainly puts into perspective just how dangerous this sport is at the pro level, and we'll cover the human reality of these situations later on. But when it comes to fantasy, even the consensus number one selection can go down, and recently it's happened like a soul-crushing amount of times. Coaches also get a slight competitive advantage when they leave a player's status ambiguous, so navigating a week's reports and interviews means sifting through a huge pile of lies. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not saying the players and coaches trying to win actual games owe me any assistance in beating my buddy Caleb, who once drafted 3 kickers. But it is certainly difficult to put into words the mental anguish of just needing a couple more points from your last player on a Sunday night, and slowly putting the pieces together that even though they were active, it's now halftime and they haven't been on the field. Now, all of this so far has just been about the flaws fantasy football has as a made-up game. But when that becomes a legitimate negative in the real world is when some mouth breather uses their fantasy team's loss as an excuse to go berate a player on social media. And let's be clear, if you go do this, you can go f*** yourself. Getting emotionally invested in the outcome of a game is one thing, and I've certainly been there, but if you think that somehow warrants direct messaging CeeDee Lamb, you're a dork and I'm scheduling you a lobotomy. Some NFL players have embraced fantasy football, and I think that's awesome, but I do absolutely understand the players who loathe its existence, because it really only takes one anonymous asshole to give the entire game a negative association. Something that can get lost in the fray of the never-ending injuries and talk of the next waiver pickup is that underneath every helmet on the field is an actual human being. Now, this video was put together before Nick Chubb's horrifying injury on Monday Night Football, but it's absolutely a sobering reminder of what these players are risking every time they go out there. So if an injury happens and somebody's first thought is to post, "Damn, I have him in my lineup," figure out a way to smack them. I think there's also some merit to the idea that fantasy football has bled its way into real football discourse in a way that makes it worse overall. If you're not able to maintain a buffer between the two, it's only a matter of time before you're foaming at the mouth about how Arthur Smith has to be drawn and quartered, for no other reason than that Kyle Pitts hasn't gotten enough targets to justify your third-round draft pick. When your definition of a good play call starts relying on whether or not your player touched the ball, it's time to take a deep breath and delete the fantasy app off your phone until you calm down. The one simple fact about fantasy football that many are in denial about is that its biggest deciding factors are luck-based, even though it appears on the outside as a game of skill. This is doubly true when you get to the playoffs, and your prize pools and bragging rights in the vast majority of leagues come down to a single arbitrary week or two's performances. There's certainly truth to the idea that a skilled player will make it to the playoffs more often than an unskilled one over a sample size of multiple years, but once it's single elimination time, your time is probably better spent just building a shrine and saying some Hail Marys to the fantasy gods. The pursuit of looking clairvoyant has also led to the creation of hundreds of different channels, websites, and analysts out there dedicated to fantasy football optimization. I know because I can't imagine doing my dishes without some of the ones I've listened to for years now. But even the most analytical and well-reasoned arguments in the world can be flipped on their head for nothing more than a player making a bad cut or a coach having a bad day. Matthew Berry is essentially the godfather of bringing fantasy football to mainstream sports media, and he used to have a show on ESPN where he gave his takes while talking to puppets and having a truly weird amount of sexual tension with his co-host. His new show consists of him getting drunk at Applebee's, and this is what full-time fantasy football will do to a man. So yeah, fantasy football sucks, but here's the thing. Even with all of that said, fantasy football is still one of my favorite things in the world. I did just complain a lot about it, and I wasn't lying about any of those things, but to be honest with you, if I hadn't started playing fantasy football as a kid, I probably wouldn't be talking to you today, because it had that big of an impact in growing my love for the NFL. Having a reason to watch those Thursday night matchups that make you question if you're watching a professional product can flip those games from snooze fest to outright entertaining, and if you take care to not become that fantasy player we talked about earlier, then you become a better fan of the game overall. If you've got a shred of competitiveness in you, you'll become aware of even the most fringe offensive names and knowledge of what certain defenses and defensive playmakers excel at. That stake in the game can be achieved by standard betting as well, sure, when legal, but I think the true reason I would recommend fantasy football is that ultimately it's a tool to bring people closer together. After my hometown friends and I graduated from high school and all went in separate directions, the fantasy league we started mostly on a whim became the main reason a lot of us are still in touch year after year. Especially in our increasingly isolated world, that type of thing can be priceless, and honestly, some of my favorite football memories of all time consist of dying laughing at a missed extra point or garbage time interception that were completely meaningless outside the context of fantasy football. And for as frustrating and depressing as the game can be, for sure, when things do click into place and go exactly how you envisioned them, I swear to you that you can feel your brain expand to the size of a baby hippo. In that moment, you are the smartest person on the face of the planet, even if not a single normal person will ever comprehend your genius. Are those moments few and far between? Oh, absolutely. I'm not here to lie to you, but I'll probably continue to chase them for the rest of time. So to those of you out there that have fantasy teams this year, excluding the people who message players, good luck. And to anyone still listening without a fantasy team, you should consider yourself lucky in your own way.